So we've talked about how responsive demand is. We've talked about how responsive supply is. The only reason that we would care about any of this is to really think about what's going to happen in the market, right? How is all this elasticity stuff going to matter, and how's it going to change, interact with changing markets, right? We sort of might have a sense that, like, okay, as the price changes, people are going to stop buying TVs more quickly than they're going to stop buying plane tickets. But what does it actually mean? Does that mean that the price of TVs is going to be lower than the price of plane tickets? Maybe, but we don't know. Let's figure out what's going to happen. So let's take an example. We'll talk about Vietnam and going to college. So it's well known, and this has been true for a long, long time. It continues to be very true. People with a bachelor's degree earn significantly more in the labor market on average than people who don't have bachelor's. Also, after the soldiers came home from Vietnam, in the United States, they got free college education. Right? You come back, you're a veteran, you get a free college education. So what's this going to mean? You get free college education, a bunch of people come back from the war all at once. Suddenly, you're going to have a massive increase in the number of college-educated workers, right? And that's exactly what we see, right? 4 years or so after all the soldiers came back, you got just a massive influx of people with college degrees on the labor market. So, first question, what would we expect to happen to the wages of college-educated workers? Any guesses?
They're going to probably drop.
They're going to drop, right? This is an increase in supply. We have an increase in the number of suppliers, right? An increase in the number of suppliers increases supply. I don't have a supply shift turned up right now, but you know what it looks like. So we have supply. Little mini graph. You would expect price to drop, wages to drop. So that is what we see. So here, you have the beginning of the 70s. The soldiers come back, they all get college degrees, they start entering the labor market. We see a drop. And this is the ratio of the earnings that you get with a college degree versus not having a college degree. So it drops. It drops not just for men, who are the massive majority of the soldiers, but also for women because they're competing in the same market, right? So we see a drop. It goes from something like 25% wage bump for a college degree for men, 38% for women, drops down to something like 20% and 28%. Right. So great, supply and demand curve's done its job. We saw a shift in the world. We said, hey, that's a supply increase. We predicted the price is going to go down. Prices went down. Great. However, that's only like the first 20% of this graph. What happens next? After they drop, they come back up. What's that all about? So to think about this, we're going to need to think about elasticity. So let's think about elasticity in the context of college-educated workers. So at the time, in the 70s, the demand for college-educated workers was highly inelastic. It was not very elastic. It was inelastic. So we have whenever the price changes, we're going to see a small change in quantity. We're looking at this graph right here. Right? The demand for college-educated workers, very inelastic. Now, why was it inelastic? Well, if we think back to the early 70s, a lot of the industries that we have today that just hire people with college degrees, like a lot, didn't really even exist at the time, or at least they didn't exist in the same format where they were expecting to hire a bunch of people with college degrees, right? Tech sector basically didn't exist, right? A lot of the industries that we have now that are highly technical and require a lot of training and education, they were just simpler at the time. They didn't require as much training and education. So you get a bunch of new college-educated workers in, you're like, oh, hey, these guys are all skilled and they got, they learned a bunch of stuff. What are we going to do with them? I don't know. I don't know. Send them to do the same work that everybody else is doing, right? So there just wasn't the ability to absorb all that new labor, all that new skilled work. So a bunch of them come in, wages drop, as you'd expect, but nothing much is happening with demand, right? So let's think about what's happening because demand is really inelastic. Let's compare the same supply shift on these two graphs, right? So imagining that we have the new college-educated workers coming in. So we're going to draw the same supply shift on both graphs. Let's go from the same beginning point on both graphs. Right, so that's our starting spot. And I'm going to do the exact same size of shift. So the same supply shift on both graphs there. And we can ask ourselves, well, given this supply shift, how much is quantity changing? How much is price changing? And you can see that in this first scenario, we get a much smaller change in price and wages than we do over here, right? There's a bigger drop in the price. So what this is telling us is that the more inelastic demand is, when supply increases, you would expect prices to drop by more than they would in a more elastic market. You can think about why this would be in a different context, right? Let's imagine two different scenarios where, let's say food. We talked about food as being a highly inelastic good, right? Versus Oreos as being something that are more elastic, okay? So huge supply increase in food. We get way more effective at producing food. And so what's gonna happen? People are gonna be like, hey, food's way more productive. How much more do I want to get? Well, a little bit, because it's not perfectly inelastic. I'll buy a little bit more, but I don't really want that much more. But all the suppliers are like, you don't want that much more, but we just made a whole bunch more. So I have to lower my prices really, really far in order to get you to buy this stuff and make the market click, right? It's really inelastic. People just don't want that much more of it. And so, you're going to have to lower the prices a whole bunch if what's happening is the costs are going down, right? There's just more suppliers in the market. As opposed to Oreo says, hey, we got way more effective at making Oreos. They're way cheaper for us to make now. Everyone's like, oh, great. Yeah, I can use some Oreos. If you're going to make them cheaper, then I'll just buy a bunch more Oreos, right? So we would expect that we're going to see more movement along the quantity axis than along the price axis. So the price of Oreos would not drop as much as the price of food would. So we're in the situation where the demand for college-educated workers is highly inelastic, okay, which is telling us that we're likely to see a big change in wages, which we saw a pretty big change in wages, right? It dropped the wage premium by like 20 percentage points, right? But we're still at the point where we're talking about the price drop. We're not talking yet about why the prices came back up. Right? So what's going to happen after all these soldiers got their degrees? Oh, we did the supply shift. Okay, so what is one of the determinants of demand elasticity we think might help explain why the prices went up over there? What's going to change? Your three determinants. What might help us go to the next step chronologically? Only three options. You could just guess randomly and you'd be right a third of the time. Time, yes, it's going to be time. So what we determined was that the longer you wait, the more time you give people to respond, the more responding they're going to do. In other words, as time goes on, this graph sort of turns into this graph, right? People get more elastic, right? That steep demand curve sort of shallows out a little bit, right? And we are going to be more responsive. So you can sort of imagine the logic here, right? You're an employer in 1975. You're like, wow, look at all these really cheap college-educated workers that are flooding the market. There's so many of them, and they're so cheap. I better shift what I'm doing so that I can hire and make use of more of them, right? I'm going to start a tech company. I'm going to modernize my systems. I'm going to do whatever it is that I can take advantage of this super cheap resource to an employer, right, of college-educated workers. Right? So they can't do that immediately. You can't start Microsoft on a dime, right? It takes a while. But this is the time at which you saw the founding of Microsoft and Apple and a lot of those companies from the first sort of big post-IBM tech revolution. All these companies were founded partially because of all this super cheap college-educated labor that was just sort of sitting around, not being very expensive. So super easy to start a new company like that or to modernize your systems. So as that happens, demand gets more elastic. People are able to respond more fully to this price change over time. This graph starts to look like this graph. And as this gets shallower and shallower, you can see that the quantity difference is going to get actually bigger. But the price drop from before is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. If this demand curve was perfectly flat, there wouldn't be any wage change at all. Right? So that sort of explains for us how we would expect initial supply increase, price drops, and then demand gets more elastic. Shallower, the price drop from the original point gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And we sort of go back up towards where we started. Now, of course, it actually ends up going beyond where it started But by this point, we're like 20 years out, and there's plenty of other things going on in the market too. But we got at least this first dip and recovery going on. Past this point, probably what's happening is demand shifts, increases in demand for college educated labor. And that's a separate thing. That's not Vietnam way, at least not directly. So what do we have so far? We have that as one side of the market shifts, the elasticity on the other side really matters for what the change is going to be. Right? So if supply shifts, if demand is highly inelastic, we're going to see this big price change and a very small quantity change. If demand is very elastic, we're going to see a small price change and a big quantity change. Same thing is going to happen on the other side of the market. If demand shifts, so let's take the same demand shift. So over here, supply is very elastic. We get a sort of muted price change and a big quantity change. Over here, supply is more inelastic. We get a big price change and a relatively small quantity change. This is sort of what it looks like when the price of anything like shoots up super, super high, right? If supply is very inelastic. So take, for example, right now the production of instant COVID tests, right? Supply of instant COVID tests is extremely inelastic, at least in the United States, because we only have one approved supplier, right? Other parts of the world, they got more approved suppliers. In the United States, we only have one. Which means that if the demand for those instant tests and thus the price people are willing to pay goes up, then they just can't change their production that much, that quickly. There's only one factor, right? They just can't make 10 million tests a day. It's not going to happen. So because supply is very inelastic, when Delta hit and the demand for these tests went up, we would expect the quantity is not going to change all that much, and we're going to see price increases that are really, really, really big. Right? And I don't know what's going to be right now, but last time I checked, one of these tests on Amazon was like $1,000. Oh, hey, they're back. Oh, all right. Okay, I know what I'm doing. Okay, so, well, last time I checked, it was like $1,000. But that's what we'd expect, right? Inelastic supply. Once they finally get around to responding and they can produce more, then we would expect that the supply is going to get more elastic. The price increase is not going to be quite as much.